higher ed's a big deal in Illinois. It's a big deal for a number of reasons. This little graphic here shows you why we have to start paying better attention to funding our public institutions of higher learning in the state. If you go to the column on the far left, that's the enacted 2000 general fund budget. That's just the nominal dollar amount enacted in that year. The very next column you see is those exact same dollars just adjusted for inflation. So they're equal terms, but put in today's dollars. So what 4.6 billion bought for K-12 in the year 2000 would cost $9.7 billion today. The third column is what the FY 2025 enacted general fund budget appropriates to each of these core services. And I should point out, these services represent about 95% of all service expenditures the state of Illinois makes through its general fund. And then the last two columns shows you whether or not the investment has grown or not. Go down to higher ed. Even after a number of repeated and in some cases significant enhanced year-to-year investments by the Pritzker administration in higher ed, at the end of this fiscal year, we will be funding it at a level in real inflation-adjusted dollars that's almost 42% less than the level we funded it at back in the year 2000 under Republican Governor Ryan. That's a pretty significant cut. If you go to the next slide, what you'll see is it's had a lot of impact on tuition and fees. So this shows you the percentage of higher ed costs at the university level in Illinois covered by state appropriations through the general fund versus what's called UIF, and that's just tuition and fees. So in the year 2003, go to the far left here, state appropriations actually covered almost 75% of the cost of a student attending a public university in our state, while tuition and fees only covered 25%. Our most recent complete data for national comparisons goes through 2022. And what you could see is by 2022, the state investment had dropped to covering just about 35% of the cost of a student attending a public university in Illinois, whereas tuition and fees were up to 64%. And while there's been a national trend, I thought I would include that on here so you could see that of a decline in general fund support for higher education. Our rate of decline in support for higher ed in Illinois vastly outstrips the national average. In fact, by over 50 percentage points over this period of time, if you look at the dollars involved. So if you go to the next slide, that's actually had an impact on families, and we thought we'd break it down by both income and race and ethnicity. So the graphic on the left compares Illinois in the yellowish mustard ugly color versus the national average cost for household income of covering 1 year at a public university. So the national average cost for a typical state is take 61% of the income of a family in the lowest quintile of earnings. Now that's a lot, but look at Illinois, 100%. So we basically have made it unaffordable by any stretch for low income or even, middle low income families to afford university. And if you go down the comparison between us and the nation, we're higher, take a bigger percentage of household income than the national average across the board. And the reason for that is this big disinvestment since the year 2000. Now, that's had an impact along racial lines as well. So if you go to the graphic on the right, what you could see is in Illinois now is in orange. Illinois, the cost of attending a public university in our state takes 18% of the median household income of a white family, 12% of a black, it's a 12% cost at the national level. But look at what happens when we go to a black family. Once again, tuition and fees in Illinois consume 33% of median household income for a black, almost double what it consumes for a white family in our state. And that's way above the national average. And you see this repeated for Latinx families, et cetera. So the bottom line is the disinvestment in higher ed over the last couple of last couple of decades has really driven up the cost of higher education in our state. And that's had an impact not just along class and income lines, but along racial lines and in academic outcomes. So if you go to the next slide, what you'll see is bachelor's degree completion by race in Illinois. And you see the white and Asian populations doing relatively well, and you see the Black and Latinx populations not so much. A lot of this is tied into the prohibitive cost on the front end, right? And what we see, and there's all kinds of polling data that support this, survey data, that many Black and Latino students drop out of university before completing it because they've incurred debt, they can't afford to pay the debt, and they can't afford to continue on in college. Literally, we're costing them out of higher education. And that is highly problematic for one simple reason. Uh, According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, right now, about 63% of all new job openings in America require a college degree. 63%. And if you look back about 20 years, what you'll also find is the only cohort of workers in America that have seen their incomes increase at a rate greater than inflation have a college degree. So just graduating high school is not enough anymore. It's not enough to, like it once was, put a car or two in the garage and a kid or two through college. For the most part, you really need to get that university degree. And the public universities ought to be generally available to those populations that have traditionally, been sidelined by the economy, and it's just not happening in Illinois. It hasn't been happening because, in large part, of the disinvestment by the state, which has led to driving tuition and fees up for these other populations. Excuse me. Go to the next slide, please. So that led to the establishment of the Equitable Public University Funding Commission. I served as a commissioner on that commission. It was established by the General Assembly. It was co-chaired by Senate Majority Leader Kim Lightford and State Representative Carol Amons. They were very concerned about the inequity in our funding, the inequities created by our funding approach to higher education in Illinois, and in particular, its distributional inequities by race and ethnicity. So we as a commission were established to literally do like we did with the evidence-based funding formula. Take a data-driven approach to identifying a formula that would end up making a better investment, more adequate investment in higher education over time, have that investment be driven by principles of equity and distributed by principles of equity, but also create some stability elements in higher ed funding, something that's been very much lacking for higher ed for the last few years, last 2 decades. So our commission goals, and you can see them all here, we're providing equitable funding so students can receive a really good educational experience, whatever institution they attend. We were supposed to make college more affordable for all students, provide predictability, stability, and limited volatility in higher ed funding, and have a hold harmless. Did our work, issued a big report, which I'm sure you all read in February of 2024. I hear the laughing, even though you're all muted. Uh, and then Senate Majority Leader Kim Lightford and Carol Amons, who were the co-chairs of the commission, put in the bill drafted, predicated on the commission's recommendations, known as SB 3965, and entitled the Adequate and Equitable Funding Formula for Public Universities Bill. So next slide, please. So what's really in this bill? Well, for the most part, and I'm going to highlight in a couple of places where it doesn't, the bill completely follows the commission's recommendations. It could not be a complete bill and just follow the commission's recommendations, because there were a couple of areas we as commissioners weren't able to resolve. So those open areas, fine for a commission report, not so fine for legislation. So we had to make a decision, and we did when we drafted the legislation. It does create a formula that defines an adequacy target for every public university. And that probably sounds familiar. We borrowed principles and concepts from the K-12 approach, the evidence-based model. We wanted things to be evidence-based. We wanted them to identify a target of resources every university needed. So the principles were similar, but the actual math involved and the formula itself very, very, very different. So the adequacy target we came up with, it identifies a total cost of what research and or evidence indicates it takes to do a number of things. Number one, and this was really core to the commission's mission, we wanted to increase enrollment of traditionally underrepresented students at public universities. And you see from the data that is Black kids, Latinx kids, Pacific Islanders, low income kids. We really wanted to make sure that they had a greater percentage, we have a greater percentage of those students getting out of high school and entering college. Number two, we wanted to have universities with the capacity to support every student to graduate within 5 years of enrollment. We wanted to have an adequacy target that identified literally all core instructional costs a university would incur for its different programs. This is very different from K-12 funding, because if you think about it, an engineering program, a nursing program, they are much higher cost than a liberal arts program, let's say in English literature. So we really had to dig down, drill down deeply into the various costs of providing these kinds of programs at a high level and to diverse student populations. And of course, you got to keep the lights on, you got to maintain your facility, so basic operations and maintenance. Universities, unlike K-12, have research missions, and their research missions vary from university to university. So we really wanted to take that into account, make sure that whether you were a research one, research two, whatever university, you were getting an adequate funding per student into your adequacy target. And then each university also has a unique mission and does unique things in their communities. And so we looked at that and we tied all this stuff together. We looked at national averages and we came up with a formula that literally designed an adequacy target that would cover all these things. Now, once you have an adequacy target, then you need to identify how close every university is to actually having the resources needed to satisfy the adequacy target. And so this is defined in the legislation as something called the resource profile. A research profile consists of some of state funding, of course, and not actual tuition and fees. And I will talk about that later. If you want to take the pressure off of tuition and fees and shift more of the responsibility for funding higher ed away from tuition and fees into the state, then just locking in existing tuition and fees locks in the current system. It locks in the current high rates, and frankly, it locks in the current inequities. So instead of using actual tuition and fees, we use something called equitable student share. It's a hypothetical calculation. I will get into that in some detail. And then we also looked at some other resources that are available to universities. Once you subtract out a university's resources from its adequacy target, you get its gap. And that's sort of common sense. The next slide sort of shows you a little bit more detail of the various elements, and I'm going to go into these various elements that collectively comprise the adequacy target for every university. So if you go to the graphic on the left, the bar chart there, the base elements that we costed out for adequacy target fall into the categories of instruction and student services, student center, and in that category, they have student-centered access, academic supports, non-academic supports, and core instructional program costs. Then you have, like I said, mission, public service and artisy, research, and then operations and maintenance. And so you could sort of see that we're already building subcategories under each main category. And then a bunch of research was done to identify national and state averages and best practices in all these areas and then cost them out. So once again, not while borrowing concepts from the K-12 funding of making sure everything is evidence and research based, it certainly isn't a copy in any stretch. The formula is dynamic, and I want to emphasize that. So it will recalculate adequacy gaps and adequacy targets every single year. And we want to make sure that it lives with the modern economy. There are market-based changes to these costs. There are new best practices over time. Of course, inflation impacts everything. Enrollment changes impact everything. And frankly, we want enrollment changements to be positive. We want to grow enrollment, particularly for underrepresented students. And we wanted to build into the adequacy target calculation funding so that universities had the resources to attract and retain more of these kids. And so that's all part of it. The other thing is when we get to the distribution, I put a paragraph on it here. There's a slide or two on it later. We really wanted to ensure that those universities that were already enrolling a disproportionate number, a higher number of traditionally underrepresented student populations received additional resources sooner. For those of you familiar with K-12, it'd be kind of like the tier 1 schools, which are furthest from having their adequacy targets satisfied, get a priority in distribution of new state money to K-12. We wanted to create some sort of priority distribution in the university setting to ensure these universities that are already stepping to the plate and taking in a significant portion of underrepresented kids get additional funding first, because they tend to be, think about the governor states, the Chicago states, the Northeastern Illinois, the worst funded universities when we started running the numbers. Go to the next slide, please. All right, so now let's dig into the actual calculation. This is all fun here. This is the good stuff. So the first of the three adequacy components is instruction and student services, and it includes a couple of main categories. Student-centered access. That's literally what it costs universities to recruit students into the door of different races, ethnicities, etc. Academic and non-academic supports. Those are the things students need once they are in the door to succeed academically. And then you see below that core instructional program costs. These were all determined, predicated on the actual cost, average cost of delivering certain types of instructional programs. So you see the first thing for each of these is a base cost per student. That base cost per student is literally predicated on a 3-year average, rolling average. It will be in the legislation, is in the legislation. But it doesn't stop there, because we are not satisfied where we currently are in Illinois. So the base cost already has built into it another adjustment. And that adjustment is, what would it cost overall, modifying these elements, to get our graduation rate from higher ed in Illinois up from its current level of 63.3% of all students graduating to 70%. There's data on this, and it's basically about $600 per percentage point in growth. So that added, $4,200, and then we had to adjust that by inflation, and then we had to spread it appropriately across the base elements. So these base elements do start with an average cost, but then include this additional investment for our universities to give them the resources they need to not only attract but to retain kids and get them to graduate at a higher level than what they're graduating now. Then you move to the next column. Each of these base costs has an adjustment for equity. And the adjustments for equity are predicated on differentials in retainment and enrollment. So the first line, student-centered access, we looked at whether or not a particular demographic of students, say a Black kid or a low-income kid or a Latinx kid, had an enrollment percentage that was lower than average. If so, then a student hitting whatever that profile was entitled to generate a funding adjustment predicated on equity, the university, and depending on whether they're categorized as low or medium. I have factors on that in a slide. Same with academic and non-academic supports, except here, the gap we looked at was gaps in retention and graduation. And we looked at whether or not the adjustment needed to be for students qualified in this category with big gaps for intensive support, high support, medium support, or low support. So those are the basic equity adjustments, and I'm going to go through how those were derived in the next slide. And then there's a concentration factor. So if a university, let's say a Chicago State or a Governor State, had a significant percentage of its undergrad population in the intensive or high category of support, then there'd be another bump, that per student adjustment of 50%. And once again, you see the percentages here. I'll read them out, but you can read them yourself. If instead the concentration was 60 to 75%, it'd be a 30% bump, 50 to 60%, a 10% bump. And so these get applied to those adjustment amounts. Then for core instructional programs, like I told you before, the base cost per student for all programs, including that little delta that we added in there to bump up the overall state graduation rate, was $9,797. And then we looked at different programs that were high cost, health professional, and medical. Now, in the commission report, medical was to be determined. They did not come up with a final recommendation on medical. We did add in an adjustment for medical. We added an adjustment for health professionals, and we added in an adjustment for high cost programs like engineering and nursing and those kinds of things. So that's the basic starting point, all driven by enrollment and all tied into current base costs, adjusting those base costs to get graduation rates up from 63.3 to 70%, and bringing in and successfully graduating a significantly higher percentage of traditionally underrepresented students. There you have the beginning point. If you go to the next slide, the equity adjustment tiers identified in the bill, you saw that some were low, medium, et cetera, et cetera. So for the first equity adjustments, the student access, getting kids in the building, a disparity of 1 to 10% in enrollment rates for a particular ethnic group was deemed a low tier disparity and generated an equity adjustment amount of $500 per kid. A disparity of 11% or greater in enrollment was considered a medium level and generates an adjustment of $1,000 per kid. Then you get to the supports once students are in the door. So retention to graduation rates, if there's a disparity of 1 to 6% between the student's demographic, be it low income, rural, et cetera, and the overall average rates, then that's a low tier disparity, gets an adjustment at $2,000 per kid, disparity of 6 to 10% in retention rates, medium, $4,000 adjustment per kid, disparity of 11% or greater, high, $6,000 per kid. And then a lot of the research shows that if an underrepresented student demographic clicks off 2 categories or more, they really need more support than if they're just in 1 category. That's what qualifies you for an intensive adjustment per kid. So let's say you're low income and rural. Chances are you're going to qualify for the intensive adjustment of $8,000 per kid. And then this is all driven by enrollment. So this differs a tad from the commission's recommendations, because the commission recommendations had similar tiers and equity adjustments by a dollar amount, but they were specifically tied to racial and ethnic groups rather than gaps. We felt with this Supreme Court, the rulings in the North Carolina and Harvard case on affirmative action, that we didn't want to come anywhere near something that might trigger a challenge predicated on strict scrutiny, and found that just tying it into these gaps, whether they be in enrollment or retention, was a much better way to go. And it literally mirrored the outcomes if we did it by race, ethnicity, income, etc. So that's the reason there is a little variance from the commission report here. Next slide, please. Then I told you there's other aspects of higher education. Like I said, it's not like K-12. So the research mission of the university. So you start with that. And the base cost of that per student, all students, $600 for every university. And then depending on whether you're a research 1, 2, or 3 university, predicated on your Carnegie classification, gives you an additional adjustment per student. So University of Illinois, they're a research 1 institution. In addition to their $600 per kid, they'll get another $1,000, $200 per kid added into their adequacy target because they have significant costs associated with their research. Public service and artistry, that's sort of what the university does in contributing to its community. There is no adjustment here. We looked at average costs of the different things universities do to be good neighbors and you know, make arts available to the community, let's say, or you know, bring in speakers, all that other stuff that they do. And there is a cost associated with that. And so we wanted to make sure we covered that in their adequacy targets. This is just driven very much by average cost. Then the final component of the adequacy target is just operations and maintenance, O&M. Institutional support is a dollar amount already reported to the Illinois Board of Higher Education as sort of the per student cost of keeping the facilities clean and all that other stuff, right? And it comes in at about $1,900 per kid. But we did notice that there is an economy of scale, that the larger the university and the university's facility, the lower the cost per kid. So there is an adjustment here for smaller universities, and it's a sliding scale adjustment from 45% to 0 based on the total enrollment and capped at 20,000 kids. And there's a little formula in the legislation that handles this. The university presidents were very supportive of this, including, I think, interestingly, those at the larger universities that say, yeah, those universities with smaller campuses really do have higher institutional support costs than we do. And then physical plant, it is what it is. You gotta replace the roof every once in a while. You gotta redo your sidewalks and your driveways every once in a while, whatever. And there's maintenance costs you just got to incur on a regular basis. And so that comes out to about $7.78 per square foot. However, lab space is much more expensive than regular space. So for those facilities on campus that are lab space, there's another adjustment there of $1.54 per square foot. Next slide, please. So that's the adequacy target. So now I'm sure you all know precisely how that's computed. I'll give you a quiz when I'm done with my presentation, and we'll make sure you get it all right. But it does build on, you know, everything that the commission was charged with, right? It builds on ensuring universities get their core costs covered. It builds on ensuring our goals for higher education can be attained through additional resources to get graduation rates up. And it builds on the equity challenges that we've seen that have come out of our current approach to higher ed funding, which has led to a very inequitable system. So now we have to determine the resources. And I told you there's a couple of things we look at. The easiest one, state dollars. We know what the state's giving you, boom, that's a dollar amount. But then I told you we don't use tuition and fees, and we really don't want to bake into the system the current high level of tuition. We want to take pressure off of tuition. And what I will tell you is, if this legislation passes and gets funded as identified in it, the state of Illinois will go from covering roughly 35% of the cost of higher education, 57%, and tuition and fees will go from covering roughly 65% of higher education costs down to 43. So it's a really good thing. But we can't do it if we bake in the inequities. So we came, and it's the worst name in the world. It's called equitable student share. We should have called it allocation of costs to the state for higher ed or something like that, because that's really what it is. What it does is create a hypothetical calculation based on students and their demographics. It says if a student has certain demographic characteristics, we think the state should be covering X% of the cost of that student attending university. And you go down to the factors here. So every undergrad, for instance, we think the state should be covering at least 30% of the cost of that student's attendance at a public university. Period. End of story. If you're an undergrad, you're from the state. You at most, you as a student should pay 70%. The state should be paying 30%. But if you're an underrepresented minority, go to the next column. We feel the state should be covering an additional 50%. These are cumulative. So if you're an underrepresented minority who happens to be an undergrad, we feel the state should be covering 80% of the cost of you attending public university. Underrepresented minority means, based on enrollment rates, there's a gap between your demographic and the overall enrollment rate averages. All right. If you're low income student, we feel the state should cover 50% of the cost of your education through appropriations. And if you attended a tier 1 or tier 2 school, 10%. If you're an adult, 25%. These are cumulative, but they cap at 100%. So if you're a low income, underrepresented minority who's an undergrad, we feel you should have no cost of attending public university. The state should cover that full cost. Now, you're going to have costs. This is a hypothetical calculation. This is to move responsibility for funding higher ed away from tuition and fees and to the state over time, right? This doesn't impact any particular student's current costs of attending university. Over time, it will impact all students' costs of attending university, and in a positive way. It'll drive it down. So that's why we came up with this hypothetical calculation to allocate greater responsibility to the state for funding higher ed. It was really to make university less expensive over time and put more of the responsibility back on the state. Next slide, please. Then, whenever you're doing a transformational change in public policy, the folks currently in the system get nervous, and rightfully so. I mean, I don't know how many years I worked with the League of Women Voters until we actually got the evidence-based funding formula passed. It was 15, 20 years that we worked together on school funding reform, at least. And a lot of the problem was more affluent communities were always worried, wait a minute, are you going to take away from me to give to them? I mean, I don't care if you give them more, just don't take away from me, that kind of thing. And that fear of the unknown, or the fear of a Robin Hood, really does get the individuals that are in the system and rely on state funding nervous. So we have a hold harmless, much like the K-12 system does, a base funding minimum. And so the first year of the implementation of this new legislation, every university would get the exact same amount of money from the state that it did the prior year as its starting point, And then the new money put into the formula over and above last year's base funding would be distributed according to the new formula. And much like the K-12 setting, in year 2, your base funding minimum includes whatever you got in year 1 on top of your old base funding minimum from year 1. So the base funding minimum grows every single year based on the amount of new resources you get invested from the state. So the most controversial thing, go down to the final bullet point, trying to find a way to deal rationally with endowment funding. So universities have very different access to endowment money. And some have literally over $1 billion in endowment money available. Some have next to nothing. Some have a couple hundred million. And the endowment funding is almost in all cases restricted for its use. But in many cases, that restricted use still offsets a current operating cost the university would have to cover some other way, whether it was through tuition and fees, et cetera. And in fact, the university presidents made a presentation to us where they brought their own experts that basically showed roughly 38% of all endowment expenditures in every year, national average now, cover either faculty salaries or the cost of providing academic program. Those are operating costs. You look at another 40% or so covers tuition and fees for students for whatever reason, right? Some sort of scholarship program. Well, that's tuition and fees. Tuition and fees are general revenue. So the vast majority of money that universities get from endowments covers general operating costs. I think it was mentioned when we started this presentation, I'm the Rubloff Endowed Professor of Public Policy at Roosevelt. Roosevelt University doesn't pay my salary out of their operating costs. There's an endowed fund put together by the Rubloff family that pays my salary. Yet, if that didn't exist, they would need someone to provide my course levels. I teach 6 courses that are required to get your master's degree. So one way or another, the university would have to pay it. So we did include a percentage of endowment in the resource profile. And this is something that's currently being negotiated. The presidents of the different universities have different opinions about this. But it is, you can't just sort of ignore hundreds and millions of dollars coming in for certain universities and pretend that resource doesn't exist, especially when some universities have it and some don't, and you're trying to come up with a formula that is equitable, not just in amount, but in distribution. All right, next slide, please. No, I think you skipped one. Did we skip one? Yeah. It's the slide that should say the slide just before that one. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. We do call for an increase to higher ed funding every year by at least 135 million a year, over and above the prior year. So, and this would go to the universities, just to the universities. MAP grants are untouched. They would still be funded. We would still advocate for more MAP grant money to go out, whatever. This is just to fund unfunded adequacy target. At this rate, the formula would be fully funded on an inflation-adjusted basis sometime, because it's not a hard and fast number that we could call on, but sometime between 10 and 15 years after an enactment. So it builds up the resources over time. Now, because no university is currently funded at 100% of its adequacy target, the allocation formula apportions some of this new money to 3 different things. One is a guardrail. That's an across the board appropriation that every university gets. Think about that as an inflation adjustment. So even if you're one of the better funded universities, think about a U of I, you still have costs growing every year. We still want to keep your costs down. So we are going to put more money into you every year. That's not necessarily driven by the equity part of the formula, but this is to create stability and to reduce long-term costs for all students, okay? And then what's remaining after the guardrail distribution will be split into two tranches and distributed equitably under both tranches. One is a percentage gap, so the priority would be to those universities that have the greatest percentage gaps, and the other would be a dollar gap. And the priority would be to those universities that have the greatest dollar gap between their resource profile and their adequacy target. So that's the basic allocation formula, and it works pretty much as well as you could imagine for something as complex as what we put together. So if we go to the next slide, what you'd see, the way the guardrail works, it's set at an amount that is based on the lesser of half the inflation rate or half the percentage increase in higher ed funding. So for universities, so say the state appropriations for universities jumped by 7% on a year-to-year basis, but inflation was 3%. Half of 3% is 1.5, which is less than half of 7%, which is 3.5. So the guardrail would be 1.5%. So the across the board increase every university would get is 1.5% of their base funding minimum from the prior year. That would be taken off the top of the distribution of new money in the new 135 million coming in. Okay. And then the remaining portion, like I said, gets split between these two tranches. So if you look at this table, it shows you the University of Illinois Chicago share of the adequacy gap dollars. Dollar gap is the biggest dollar gap at 23%, whereas the biggest percentage gap is like Northeastern Illinois University at 11%. This would determine how the other 50% in each category gets distributed to each of the universities. At the end of the day, it ends up being a very, very equitable distribution piece. We close those percentage gaps that are the greatest, fastest over time. Next slide, please. I just wanted to give you a little context about how this legislation would work versus existing law. So the average increase for each of the universities under our legislation on average annual year increase for the first 10 years is laid out in the first column on the left. So Chicago State would get 3.6 million a year. Eastern would get 7.9. It's on average. Governor State 7.5. Illinois State 18.9. Okay. The next column is what they have averaged over the last 10 years. Here is a stark difference here. So you can see we're really bumping up. We're trying to make up for this huge inflation adjusted cut to higher ed that I showed you in the very first slide, where current higher ed funding is 41 points less than what it was under Governor George Ryan in the year 2000. It's just embarrassing. So we're really saying up your game. And it's important that the state ups its game, because that's the only way to really address the inequities that we've seen in enrollment, retention, and graduation by income, class, and race. It's the only way to reverse that. And frankly, it's the only way to get our overall graduation rate up from its current level of 63.3% to 70%. Now, the final slide, I'm sure you're all breathing a sigh of relief. The final slide is next. We have some formula update in here, and here we did borrow a couple of things from the K-12 thing. So the higher ed board would now be responsible for calculating the adequacy gap, much like the State Board of Education does for K-12. It would set metrics for institutional performance on retention and graduation rates. It would work with the universities on their prospective spending proposals. We really want to start seeing bang for our buck, right? We want to make sure these investments are generating the outcomes we want. And because of that, we established in the legislation an accountability and transparency committee. It conducts evaluations of each university's resource allocation, advancement in student affordability, enrollment, persistent outcomes, et cetera. And it also has something much like the K-12 formula has. K-12 has something called the Professional Review Panel. This is called the Funding Formula Review Panel. And they look at the different elements of the legislation and see whether or not whether they feed adequacy target or resource profile, whether they need to be adjusted because of change in practice or new best practice, new evidence, et cetera. And then every 3 years, the panel will make recommendations for recalibration to the General Assembly and government. So that's it in a nutshell. I'm sure there are no questions because it was a sort of a no-brainer piece of legislation that I ran through, but I'm happy to answer them if you have them.
Thank you, Ralph. You know what? I'm going to take a few questions in chat. If you do have some questions, go ahead. Or if you prefer, you're welcome to raise your hand, and I believe you'll kind of show up as the first person on the screen. But I do have kind of an overarching question for you, because I love the fact that this bill follows a model that the legislature is already familiar with. And so it's something that is, although complex, somewhat easy for them to understand and maybe get over the finish line, right? What I don't love is our current budget situation in Illinois, right? And the lack of funding that our legislators have to kind of move around and make these sorts of things happen. So what I'm wondering is, was there any discussion, or is there separate discussion separate from the whole equality of funding aspect of this, to either take a look at the what I guess I'll call vacancy rates or enrollment, the opposite enrollment rates in some of our universities, and determine whether or not we should consolidate, whether we should convert some of those to maybe more of a technical type college instead of more traditional academic colleges. I'm trying to get a sense for what other kinds of considerations the state might be looking at in addition to this.
Those items we specifically did not discuss because they're not good practice. And so I'll get in, especially at the university level. So trying to have the state determine what universities ought to be teaching is a loser game. They are not, general assemblies and governors aren't going to be smarter than academics on figuring out what should be offered. That's number one. Number two, you look at our regionals, Western. A student may have everything that student needs from academic qualification standpoint and maybe even resources to attend the University of Illinois. But for family reasons, taking care of a parent, whatever, needs to stay home in Macomb. Why should they not have an option of a general university education available to them to get the degree they want just because they have family issues going on? And in rural communities, that's a much bigger issue than it is in some other communities. And so consolidation at the university level literally is bad education policy. And so because it is bad education policy, we at the commission didn't consider it, and it didn't enter into the computation of this formula. What we really tried to get to, like I said, was just how much does it actually cost to provide your current programming, but provide it at a higher level so that we could get a greater percentage of students graduating and we could get a more diverse student population attending.
Thanks. Sharon, looks like you've got a question.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Ralph. I appreciate all the info. It is astounding. And on the one hand, it doesn't surprise me, but the number is astounding that since 2000 fiscal year, higher education funding has gone down more than 40%, adjusted for inflation. I'm assuming that figure for higher education is only university. Where does community college funding come in the decrease of state funding for
That,
community colleges in
sure,
the last 20 years?
you should pick up CTBA's report last year. We are updating it on higher ed, where we include the community colleges. The technical fiscal term for them is they were screwed too. So it was another significant cut for community colleges. And in fact, MAP grants in real terms have lost a significant portion of their value in the last 25 years. So this disinvestment, Sharon, is across the board.
Right, right. Is it the same percent, 40%?
It's close.
Really? My
Yeah.
goodness.
And
Thank you.
community colleges were supposed to be funded on a stool with three legs, right? The
Right.
property taxes, tuition and fees, and state approps, and they're supposed to be a third and a third and a third. They are not.
No, no, that has never been the case actually, but it's even more disparate than that. Thank you.
There is a question in the chat here. No mention was made specifically of room and board, which
Didn't cover it. We
is a
didn't
huge-
cover it. We couldn't cover it. We couldn't find a good enough basis for covering it, meaning costs and all that other stuff. And so it is not included in this. The cost of operating the university. It's not all student costs. These are university costs. Okay. So student costs still have to be funded, especially for low-income students, through our traditional approaches, MAP grants, Pell grants, those kinds of things. Over time, maybe there could be an adjustment, but if you look at the formula, we're going from saying universities in the last 10 years on average got 7 million a year to split among them to they should have 130 million split among them. That's a pretty big jump up. And it's just focused on the university cost side. It is not including all the student cost side. I mean, you think about other student costs, adult students have childcare costs. I mean, there's a lot of student costs we didn't necessarily deal with at all. We were focused on universities.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah, probably hard to slice it too much on the student cost side because there are a lot of variables there. Before we end here, can you give us an update on kind of where this bill is? You think it's going to show up in spring session? Something we
Oh, I
should
do
keep
know
an
it is
eye
showing
on?
up. It is showing up in spring session. I'm not authorized to say, but it will probably have a slightly different bill number, indicating its importance to our co-sponsors. So it'll definitely show up. There are ongoing negotiations that are with the university community in general. I should point out, I served on the commission with all the universities. Every university was represented on the commission. And so they've had significant input. Now they haven't agreed with everything, right? I mean, I tried to highlight one of the biggest areas of contention that we are negotiating right now with the universities, and that is using endowment dollars in any way, right? So there are still some negotiations to be had, but flipping the switch, if this legislation, I'm of the opinion that universities are so better off under this formula with this target amount than they are leaving things up to chance, that eventually accommodations will be made and the legislation will pass.
Wonderful. All right. Well, you'll probably be hearing from us one way or another to kind of keep track of this as we keep our eye on the spring season. So appreciate it. If there are no more questions, we are pretty much right at 7:30. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate the generous time you offer to us to get us up to speed on important stuff that's going on in the state. So again, thanks so much for your time this evening and for your vast knowledge in this area. We are recording, and a couple of folks have said they're going to have some sessions, some watch sessions with bigger groups in their local leagues as well. So the word will continue to get spread. Thanks
It'd be
again.
great to have the league support. Really respect what your organization does. Peace.